What is going on, everyone? So it is time for my film reveal video. This is where I take a look at my film on my light box here. And typically I'll record this video a day or so after getting my film back from the lab. But this year I had two different trips. I had my trip to Death Valley in mid-February, and I got the film developed and was able to scan the pictures and get to know the images before going on my trip in very early March to Zion. So I've already looked at the film from both trips, and so I've also had the opportunity to go through and arrange everything in the order that it was shot. So this isn't really a first impression as much as it is talking about the various compositions and the thought process behind the images. So that all being said, let's get started. Now the film is in protective sleeves, so I can handle it just fine with my hands. I know sometimes people will comment about that, but it's just fine. So let's take a look at the images. This is the first image I took on the trip, and this was a tough one because it was so, the mailman is here and my dog is barking. It was so very bright that when using my spot meter, I could not meter off the bright areas as I would normally do, and also be able to read the numbers within the spot meter. So I end up just blindly aiming the spot meter at a bright area, then doing the mental math in order to make it around +2 or so. This was a bit of an experimental photo. It's definitely better suited for black and white, and actually I scanned it as a black and white and it looked pretty decent. It was more so me being curious about how the film would handle this sort of light, and it actually handled the dynamic range quite well. It goes a little bit almost kind of a greenish cyanish in the bright areas there, but it handled it surprisingly well. And all these photos, by the way, are on Fuji Pro V100. So that was more of just an experimental sort of photo. Now, this one is the scene that I found as I was hiking back to my truck that same day. This is a safety photo. This was taken when the sun was still a bit harsh, and I knew this would not be the actual light I would want to have the photo taken in. But I do like to be able to see how it turns out in those situations. And my hunch is that it'd be too contrasty, the light would be too harsh, and that very much is the case. And you'll see what happens in the next photo, which is when the sun is partially obstructed by the mountains in the distance, and you get this, it's a warm directional light, but it's a softer light and it better balances with the ambient light. So if you look at all these harsh shadows in here, and then how bright the highlights are, but compare that to the next photo, you'll see that we have a much softer take on that scene. We still have those same shadows in there, but since the intensity of the light is diminished because over half the sun is now being obscured by the horizon, we have this warm directional light that's very low angle, and you also have the influence of the blue sky, which is why those shadows are now being filled by the light from the blue sky. I'm very happy with how this one turned out. It was just a matter of framing chaos. For this one, I can't remember if I used my 240 or my 300 millimeter lens. They're fairly close in terms of focal length. But I am very happy with this one. I've scanned this one. It turned out very nice. I love the partially dried mud tiles. And in the days after photographing this, it all dried out and it didn't even look the same at all. And also I should mention that moments after taking this photo, the battery in my light meter died, which is not something you want to have happen in the middle of doing something like this. So I always have a spare. And to meter the scene, I had a gray card on the ground. I had it angled at about a 45 degree in order to catch the daylight. And I metered off that, and that's the meter reading I used for this situation. And I also threaded a 3-stop neutral density filter on, which lengthened the exposures. So now I'm not dealing with fractions of a second. It's actually measured in full seconds, which is easier to time with the stopwatch. So that's my technique for scenes like that. Next up is the exact same scene photographed in the calm light just after the sun sets below the mountains in the distance. And so now this is lit primarily by the blue sky overhead with a little bit of an influence from the light over the mountains where it's a little bit brighter over there. And if it wasn't for the fact that the previous one turned out much to my liking, I would also be very happy with this one. So this is still a very interesting photo, though I will say that between the two of them, I do find, put them this way, this one is more dynamic because you have the warm-cool balance versus this one is all very cool but in a more subdued light. And that's why I like to photograph in these various windows of light, because the same scene can take on a much different appearance. This is a canyon scene I photographed on my first full day, and while I was photographing it, I didn't think a heck of a lot of the scene, but also it has contrast. So you have contrast as subject, these light-colored rocks against this this wash here where there's some water that drained through it pretty recently, and then the warmth of those walls. And composition was a bit tricky. I was moving through the scene, trying to find an angle that gave the rocks enough breathing room. And this was also taken just before some high clouds came in and really snuffed out the light. So this was just a slight glow that I was able to work with in the canyon. I used a warming filter, and I'm okay with it. I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. It doesn't immediately jump out to me as something that I'm really drawn to, but technically it's fine. And this was taken with my 240mm lens, which is I think it's around like a 28mm, somewhere in that range, maybe a little bit wider. Depends on how you correct for the aspect ratio. Technically fine, I just don't know that I'm in love with it as much. This was taken the following morning, and this is the spot I go to pretty much every morning in Death Valley to have breakfast. It's a little bit of ways from the campground, and my truck is parked probably 15 feet away from where I'm taking this photo. So you'll see this scene a lot in the videos, in the morning videos. It's just a nice place to enjoy the morning. And I saw that there's some clouds overnight, and so when I arrived here I decided let's go ahead and see about setting the camera up in dark, which is very difficult to do because you really can't see anything on the ground glass when it's the dim sort of light. So I threw a headlamp in the foreground, and I was able to see my foreground focus based on that. Eventually, when it was light enough, I could make out the trees on the top of Telescope Peak, and so I knew that that was in focus. And then as far as composition, I used my composition framing tool, and I was able to pay attention to the edges and know that the view I see looking through that tool is the same view that I'd have here. I am quite happy with this, though I'll say that I have 3 variations of this scene, which I'll show you all of them. And I believe this was my favorite pick of the bunch, because I think I had a little bit more blue going in here. But let's take a look at the other ones as well. So on this one, we have a bit more cloud action there. A little bit more magenta perhaps in the foreground, a little less blue up there. Also, a image I really do like, and I have no real complaints about it. And I'll show you the third in that series. So this is as the sun starts to hit Telescope Peak there. You lose a little bit of the interesting light in the foreground. Yes, the clouds are nice, but at this point it becomes a little bit more divided where the sky doesn't really match the foreground as much in terms of the color. So if I look at the last two here, you'll see how I really like the blues there, and the depth of the light in the foreground is stronger there. And then I ultimately ended up with my favorite being this one, because I just really like the blue tones through here. The light in the foreground is similar, slight difference in exposure. This one's a little bit brighter, but this is the one that I went with because I feel like the background here interacts very well with the foreground, with the light there, as well as the blue tones. This right here matches these rocks here. So to me, this is the most integrated of the bunch. It's nice to have the options. That's why I like to photograph through the changes in the light. This is one I did not really have high hopes for. And just because the clouds weren't overly amazing, and it's a tough situation with a very bright sky there because I'm shooting towards the sun just after sunset. But the camera was set up and I was curious to see how it would look. This has a 3-stop hard edge grad covering just over the top of the mountains there. And we do have some interesting light striking these rocks. But this was, a lot of times when I will take a photo, it's because I'm curious to see how it'll look, as opposed to this is something I know is going to be like a portfolio photo, because you learn a little something with every photo. Could be how the film responds, could be how is my technique with the grad filter. It'll confirm any sort of feelings I have about a particular scene or particular way that the film handled it. Definitely wasn't very blue. A warming filter could have been good, but again, this is tough light and I wasn't really expecting much from this. This is obviously the same scene. This is the following morning, and this is more so the time of day I was expecting to shoot this photo as opposed to the previous one. Because now we're going to have the mountains illuminated by the rising sun back behind the camera. Now it was a tough morning from the standpoint that there were some clouds off to the east that were obstructing the light, and also it was kind of hazy. And you'll see how that plays out when the light eventually hits the mountains. There was also a little bit of clouds that morning, which you'll only see just a couple right here. You'll see them more in the next few sheets of film. But I was hoping to have a sunrise a little bit like that previous scene, well, not the previous one, but the one before that, where I had the really nice sunrise at my morning breakfast stop. But I was thinking I might be able to have some clouds illuminated here in the sky, but there really weren't any clouds over there. They're behind the camera. Blue hour photo, I was there, might as well expose some sheets of film, see how it turns out. I do like the snow-capped peak and how that integrates with the rocks there, but it's just not really interesting enough to hold my attention. And you'll see several more in that series. This is as it was a little bit lighter. You'll see a little bit of the earth shadow right there, the earth shadow back behind there. You see those clouds a little bit more of a pinkish light hitting the mountains there, a little nicer light in the foreground. So it's okay. It's a scene I would like to try again when I have the right conditions. And then this is just a little bit later. Earth shadow is dropping a bit more back there. Clouds are standing out a little bit more. Again, it's okay. It's just not, it's not really what I was hoping for. This is as the sun starts to hit the mountains, and it was just a very awkward sort of morning light. You can see the shadow right here. This is from the clouds that were back behind me. And moments after I exposed a sheet of film, that light was gone, and it took quite a while for the sun to climb over the top of those clouds and for the mountains to be illuminated. So it was a great morning to be out there. It just didn't it doesn't translate very well to a photograph. This is my safety photo of a scene out on the mud flats. And I took this more so just in case all the other scenes that I ended up, all the other windows of light, I should say, that I ended up photographing that evening, just in case those didn't work out, because there were some clouds that were building to the west. And they were threatening to snuff out all the light and have just really dreary light on the scene. So I took this as a bit more of a sketch just to see how well everything balanced. But I knew that this is not a window of great light that I would actually want to use. You see those clouds building in the background. And I think this will be an interesting series to look at, because you'll see how the light develops and how the clouds also develop in the background. So this was taken as those clouds, as the sun dropped behind the clouds to the west. So this is not a true sunset. So this is not as the sun is dropping back behind the mountains. This is as the sun is dipping behind some clouds. So it's the shadow of clouds in the foreground. And what I was really hoping for was the moment closer to sunset, where the sun is dropping back behind the mountains. You get the really orange light on these mountains as a result. And then you have that shadow that marches its way up those mountains until those are completely in shade. But look at these clouds here. These are playing very nice. This also ended up being a bit of a safety photo. And to meter this, I just used my gray card, about a 45-degree angle, spot meter off the gray card. That gives a foreground exposure, and then I have a 2-stop soft edge grad to control the brightness of the background. And because the difference between shade and sunlight in these sort of scenes is going to be 2 stops. So that's how you know it's going to be a 2-stop. But by using a spot meter, I can meter off that foreground, and then I could point it at those clouds, I could point it at the mountains. And since I'm using a 2-stop grad filter, I just take away 2 stops from that, and it'll put me in the range. I know it's kind of a technical explanation, but maybe some of you guys are interested in that. This is the one I ended up using. So this is more so the real sunset. So now this shadow here, it's not from the clouds. This is a shadow from the mountains off to the west. And the last little bit of light hitting these before that shadow marches up there. And so same scenario here, gray card, about a 45-degree angle, spot meter off that. That gives a good exposure for the foreground. And then a 2-stop soft grad is covering everything in the background. And I was metering off that cloud right there. I was metering off this, I was metering off the shadows, and everything was checking out. Typically on transparency film, if you meter something like this that is very, very bright and basically almost pure white, it should be around +2 on the spot meter. And but with this right here being what I was exposed for, that was showing nearly +4. You take down 2 stops, +2 means that's going to be white. But I am happy with how this one turned out. I just had to increase the contrast a little bit, especially for the foreground. But the clouds really played nice. This one right here, right over the ridge, circular shape, very similar to these. Everything balanced. In terms of composition, I was looking at these masses here, just trying to give them enough breathing room on the sides. And I had no clue this cloud would be there, because I set my camera up very far in advance, but it just happens that they mimic each other, which is pretty cool. So very happy with that one. And this was a photo I took after the sun had set. I knew it would not be all that great, just because it's a very dreary sort of light, but this was also a matter of just a curiosity to see how the film would handle this. It allows me to better anticipate how the film will react for future conditions. This was taken on my final morning there. Some very coarse sand that was wind blown up against this slope of a dried kind of mud clay sort of material. And I love the diagonal emphasis of this. And so I used my framing device to figure out exactly where to stand to have this cut through at a diagonal. And then set up the composition. I believe I used I can't remember if it was my 300 or my 240. Probably have it in my notes, but it was either my 300 or my 240 lens, and was able to frame it up and avoid all the plants and stuff in the background. I really like how this turned out. I have two variations of this. When I scanned it, I went a little bit cooler with it, so it's a little bit more blue tone, and I think it has a really very nice feel to it. So very, very happy with how that one turned out. And then this is another variation of that, which is not quite as cool, a little bit of a warmer tone to it perhaps. I think it was the first one that I scanned. Photos like this are very easy on large format. You just take your front standard view, angle it down a little bit of front tilt, and you'll get everything in focus because you drop that plane down. Same thing, metering gray card, makes metering so easy with this sort of stuff. And then the subject I photographed later that day. This one, in terms of composition, was a little bit tricky. I had to think through this one. The initial instinct would be to center the rock, but we have this interesting trail behind it. And so I took some pictures with my iPhone just to get a feeling for what is going to balance best. Whether it's here, 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 or here. And I found that center but elevated above the halfway point of the composition gave the best flow. I can even crop a little bit more off the top. But this was a safety photo. This was taken with my 300mm lens. I loved these little raindrops that are etched into the dried mud there. And so there's a bit of a storytelling from the aspect of, there was a big flood that came through here, a mud flow, but then after that was done, then there's some raindrops that came in there and left their mark. So it has a very interesting base texture. But as I mentioned, this is a safety photo. I took this when the sun was still up, because I was curious how that shadow, if that would be necessary or not. But I ended up going with a different variation, which is not this one. This was in calm light, a little bit after sunset, and this one's fine, but it was the twilight exposure I like the most, when things went a little bit more bluish, because once we have a little bit more of this bluish tone from the twilight, it pulls out a bit of the blue tone here, as well as here, and you also, when you have that bluish tone, it is a contrasting color to the yellowish color of the rock. So you start building a little bit of color contrast. So that's why I like this one. But I'll never know these things until I actually shoot the photo, because it's hard to figure out how that light's gonna look until I see it on the film. But I'm getting a little bit better at figuring that out in the field. I guess one disadvantage of this compared to the first is that the little droplets aren't as, they're not as dominant because you don't have the direct light hitting them, but they still do show up. And I think I kicked the contrast up a little bit on that one, but very happy with how that one turned out. Now let's switch gears to the Zion images. So this is a scene I photographed, and this is one of the very few times I will shoot more of a grand landscape photo in a place like Zion, and because it's very difficult. But what I found on this particular day is that over and over again, the sun kept striking just this right here and not the other areas. And I figured that would be a good way of me having, placing more emphasis on one particular area over the others. So what you'll see here is a variety of different situations when the light was striking just that. In a perfect world, I would have used a grad filter to help balance the foreground, but I knew based on my spot meter that I have enough detail in here where I can brighten it a little bit in post and have a similar effect without doing any weirdness up here from the grad filter, because it wasn't a defined horizon. The light was changing very quickly. So this is the first of that scene. And this is the second of that scene. And if we lay them side by side, you'll see that the differences have to do with this area here being in sun versus being in shade there. A little bit of these areas here in sun versus that in shade. And it was difficult going through these, figuring out which of them I liked the best. A little bit brighter in the foreground of this one, a little darker there. So that was my second one there. Then we have this one. This is the one actually that you'll see in the video. And it's not the best of the bunch. There's light here. This cloud is a bit distracting. A lot of blue sky there. So that's the one I didn't really, that's the worst of the bunch. And then there's this one right here. So this one has some pretty good light there, partial light there. And if I remember right, this is the one I actually went with in terms of scanning, and then I brighten the foreground. So if I show the comparison there, this one clearly not quite as good. Show this one there. I thought this brightness was a bit distracting, so I think this was taking precedence over that. So I didn't use that one. And then there's this one, which I did like. I liked the clouds over here. I thought they were pretty dynamic. You got some blue over there. But ultimately, I think I went with this one because you have a little bit more of a triangular shape to the light there. But either of these would be fine. But that is the one I ended up going with. And then brightening the foreground a little bit there. I used some front tilt as my wide angle lens. So I'm in focus here, I'm in focus there. So it worked out pretty well. I metered that at about darn near +2. It's about as bright as I can go. And then the darkest areas down here are about -2. And I know that all that will be within the range of what Provia can do. And then this is the final subject that I photographed, the Moki marbles. Now I have 2 exposures of this one. This is not the better of the 2. But what was happening is the light was changing a lot. There were some clouds that morning, and what was happening is the clouds are going by, you'd have the sun poking through and hitting the cliffs nearby and bouncing light in, and then things are changing quite a bit. But for this, just like all the other small scenes, gray card on the ground, about a 45-degree angle, spot meter it, and it gives you a very good exposure for what you're working with here. In terms of composition, I don't like things heading towards the corners. It often looks contrived. There's some like this right here. This right here, I couldn't avoid having this one go to the corner, but you'll notice that right here, I don't have anything going to the corner, nothing going to the corner, nothing going to the corner. So you have this overall movement through the scene, but I was able to avoid having multiple things go into the corners. And quite happy with how it turned out, though I will say that the next exposure right here is the better of the 2. This one has softer light. It's a bit more of the magenta side. And so this is the one I scanned, and I'm quite happy with it. From the interesting lichen there, this overlapping shape right here, the orange boundary right there. But overall, I'm quite happy with how this one turned out, and it scanned really, really nice. But overall, for both trips, to have 7 images that I'm very happy with that are portfolio grade, that's pretty cool. And I've rough edited the videos at the time of filming this video, so I gotta go through and fine tune the videos and continue to work with the images, get used to them. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around. next time.
You may have noticed this video has no ads and no sponsors, and I think it's nicer that way. If you enjoy this ad-free and clickbait-free content and want to help me live my dream, a voluntary contribution through PayPal or by joining my Patreon helps keep my gas tank full and my film freezer stocked. You can find more information by visiting my website at benhorne.com/donate. I also have prints, ebooks, and my annual portfolio is available on my website. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you around next time.